Welcome to Stifel's Sightlines podcast, focusing each week on a topic or two important to investors. Well, greetings and welcome to the Sightlines podcast. This is Mike Lookie, Stifel's Chief Investment Officer. Hey, last week we talked a lot about policies for the upcoming election, the idea of the different candidates having different views. And in this episode, as I mentioned I want to get into the investment implications of the various outcomes of the election. And so, obviously when it comes to change, if we look at the different scenarios that might unfold with this election, if we have a one-party sweep, so either the Republicans take both the presidency and both houses of Congress, or the Democrats have a sweep, basically that incrementally at least creates a little bit more control and more things can get done. So often it's the case, though, that we end up in divided government. And when that happens, it requires bipartisanship and cooperation. A lot of times things don't get done quite as quickly. So think of it as if we see a sweep, things will be changing a little bit more. If we don't, things will be slow moving. In any event, as we get into sort of looking through the lens of the investment implications, we start with the idea of how the market generally performs during election years. So, if we kind of look back to different election years over history, especially recent history, markets are kind of all over the place, but we can still take averages and kind of crunch the numbers a little bit. And one thing that we do see on average is that market volatility jumps up a little bit in the fourth quarter as we kind of approach and get to and through the election. So think the number 14% is the increase in volatility as measured by the VIX index. So all that really means, especially in the kind of market we've been in, where stocks have run up a lot, and the sort of optimism around AI and the Mag 7 and all that, we've sort of been expecting a pause, maybe a little bit of a retrenchment. Well, you couple that with a little bit more volatility. We should just sort of get ready for some volatility in the fourth quarter, and as long-term investors, stay the course typically. And so again, as it relates to general performance, that's one thing that I would say. And by the way, that increase in volatility just on average is attributed to the uncertainty, not really being sure what's going to happen in the election, sort of getting investors increasingly nervous as we approach election day. In any event, moving to sort of the implications of policies on investment considerations, obviously longer term results are driven by fundamentals. That's often related to earnings growth. And when it comes to earnings, policy does matter. So, for example, let's get into the idea of being tough on China. So it's sort of in vogue for both candidates to be talking about that. Trump is sort of threatening a lot more, 60% tariffs or whatever it might be. And he also has that sort of orientation of, hey, America first. So on one hand, if Trump's elected, for example, that means companies that are sort of more local may do better, right? I.e., depending a little bit more on onshore revenue. And by the way, 7.5% of the revenue in the S&P 500, meaning companies in the S&P 500, actually comes from China. So to the degree we see some tension with China, that serves as a headwind to revenue. So that's something we have to be mindful of. Now, turning to the energy sector, I think kind of where things could go is sort of obvious. If Kamala Harris is elected, Vice President Harris, then we would see her likely doubling down on renewable energy, clean technology, and increasing the hurdles for fossil fuel companies. If Trump's elected, he's going to work to try to unwind some of that. So, you can almost think of it as one direction or the other, depending on who's elected when it comes to energy. Same kind of thing for the financial sector. So under the Biden administration, we've seen increased regulations with agencies like the FTC, the IRS, the SEC, and Harris could continue that approach, maybe even, for example, increasing bank capital requirements, so going even harder to try to be conservative in terms of regulation on financial services. Of course, if Trump's elected, there will be this general sense of wanting to deregulate a little bit, reverse the regulation, quote unquote, let the free market go. So that's, what we would expect with the financial sector. When it comes to defense, both candidates are going to spend. We think Harris will reinforce and align with NATO. Trump will push back a little bit on NATO, want members to contribute more, but at the same time will increase spending, most likely to increase the strength of our military. And so again, spending is going to continue on either side. When it comes to technology under Trump, we would expect him to once again try to deregulate to a degree, and for example, have less scrutiny on mergers and acquisitions, so M&A activity. Under Harris, we would expect her to continue that scrutiny and maybe sponsor increased regulations, perhaps including maybe an initial attempt to regulate dimensions of artificial intelligence. And then finally, federal deficits. So the bottom line is government spending, much of it, we calculate 71% is on autopilot. What that means is it's entitlement programs and the cost of the debt. And so there's less and less that sort of discretionary when it comes to how each party might treat the ability to spend. But the bottom line is we seem stuck a bit in this deficit spending. And yet we've talked about fiscal transition and the need for there to be a focus on bringing that under control. So again, implications are a little bit longer out in terms of that issue, but something we need to stay ahead of. In any event, listen, I wanted to thank you for listening to this episode. That's what I wanted to cover. I will mention we did host a client webinar on this topic. I'm going to, in the notes to this podcast, I'll throw a link to the replay of that. And, again, we'll just keep at it in terms of monitoring what's happening with this very dramatic election. And we'll look forward to catching you on the next episode. Thanks so much.
Thanks again for listening to Stifel's Sightlines. Be sure to subscribe wherever you're listening to automatically receive each week's podcast in your feed.